All right, so this is a video for Linguistics 102, and we're talking about second language acquisition here. So this will be an overview of that module. So we start in this section looking at how we study it. So this is a similar format to what we had for first language acquisition and even for sociolinguistics and psycholinguistics. How do we study this phenomenon? And we get a couple of interesting and core concepts like the idea of an interlanguage. And we've got to remember interlanguage is that grammar that a second language learner has as they are learning that second language. The interlanguage has features from their first language, right? Because as they're learning the second language, the things they don't know, they'll often assume, or explicitly or implicitly, they may not be conscious of this, assume that the new language works the same as their first language. But of course, it also has features of the second language. As they learn new things about the second language, they incorporate them into this interlanguage. The interlanguage is systematic, which means it is a grammar. It is a kind of a language, but it's also dynamic, right? Because they're learning new things and trying to move it along. Sometimes interlanguage fossilizes before full acquisition of the target language. So the language of the second language learner may stop changing, even though it isn't quite like the language that's produced by native speakers of the target language. Of course, the goal of acquiring a language is communicative competence, right? To be able to communicate as a speaker of that language. And we can identify aspects of that competence, grammatical competence, which means competence with the structural grammatical rules of the language, textual competence, which has to do with stringing ideas together, sociolinguistic competence, which has to do with navigating the social aspects that are reflected in the use of the language, and illocutionary competence. I sometimes like to call that functional competence, the ability to do things with the language, like order food or make a request or that kind of thing. And another concept, the last concept that we get in this section, is the distinction between competence, which is knowledge of the language's forms and structures, and performance, which is the actual use. We can know something without yet being really good at using it on the fly. And if you have any experience of learning a second language, especially in late teen, or adulthood, then you'll understand that feeling of sometimes a big gap between competence and performance. So having set this up, these are the sorts of things that we want to study, and that people who research second language acquisition, as well as those who do this professionally, who teach a second language professionally and are monitoring this in their students. So that sets up, how we can examine it. And then we get into what do those interlanguage grammars look like, get into some specifics. And so we can investigate interlanguage grammars in terms of various structural properties that give us insight into the acquisition of a second language. So we will look first at phonology. And generally, when you're learning a second language, there's going to be some mismatch between the sound inventory of the first language and the sound inventory of the second language. And these differences can generate differences in pronunciation, right? The learners of a second language don't pronounce words the same way as native speakers of that second language, even when they do know the words. And phonological, we can look at the process of moving from that mismatch to a more native-like thing. We look at, there's a couple of hypotheses that we compare here. There's the markedness differential hypothesis, which talks about learning in the context of, there's two different versions of how something works, and maybe the one that's more marked is going to be more difficult to acquire. There's also the similarity differential hypothesis. So if you're learning something new, the more different it is from where you start, the more difficult it'll be. And maybe, more different means less marked, in which case those two hypotheses would predict different levels of difficulty, perhaps different learning curves there. We see that phonological, it's not just individual sounds that can be acquired, but also phonological features such as voicing contrasts. If your first language doesn't have a voicing contrast on a particular set of sounds, but the second language does, other things like tone contrast. So phonological features are something that can be acquired. We also look at syllable structures, which often differ greatly between languages, and we look at some strategies that deal with that in terms of what we colloquially call accents. The pronunciations. How does someone deal with pronouncing words in a language they're acquiring when they don't yet have the syllable structure in place to maybe handle all of the consonant clusters if they're learning English, or the syllable structure at all. Some languages, for example, don't allow codas. So how do they deal with that? So we look at some strategies around that. And stress assignment is another thing that really does come out, and it becomes quite noticeable with language learners. Different languages, even when the two languages both use stress, they can assign stress in different ways to different syllables of the word, and that can affect the interlanguage. We move on to syntactic things. Some languages allow null subjects and some don't, and so how does that affect the learning process? We look at the subset principle in this context, which kind of frames learning relative to markedness, and it also highlights the important difference between, as a learner, getting positive evidence. I think the language works like this, and then I see something that directly contradicts it, and negative evidence. I think the language works like this, and I never see anything that directly contradicts it, but if it works like this, there's some things I might expect that I don't happen to see, right? So the difference between those different types of evidence and then looking at the subset principle can kind of shape how we expect learning to progress or maybe fail to progress. And there's a lot of other syntactic differences. Do you form questions by adding a word at the beginning, at the end, somewhere in the middle? Do you form questions by moving around the order of the words? Do you do a bit of both? How does that work? This is something that people have to learn. So some various syntactic patterns that we look at in this module. Morphologically, we see a comparison, first off, of the order of acquisition of various morphemes in learners of English as a second language compared to learners of English as a first language. So children who are learning English as their first language learn certain morphemes typically in a particular order, and if you're learning English as a second language, that order is in some ways similar, but there are some prominent differences, and so that's something that we need to explain, and there are various things that can explain that. Of course, if you're learning English as a first language, you don't have another language behind the scenes that may be influencing you. Also, when you're learning your first language, you're also developing cognitively, and those developmental stages will constrain what you can learn and what you can acquire in a way that by the time you're acquiring your second language, you've moved through those cognitive stages. They're not a constraint anymore, so that can affect that order. Right. We also learn in the context of morphology and syntax about this impaired representation hypothesis and a kind of competing hypothesis, the missing surface inflection hypothesis. Two explanations for how we can get non-target-like productions by second language learners. And we see a little bit about how researchers can empirically test which of these hypotheses is operative in a particular situation. Is someone not producing the target-like form because they haven't quite learned the target-like structure, right? They don't have the competence, or are they not producing it because although they know the structure, the production of it is impaired because maybe they only lightly have that in their mind and it's not firm enough that it's automatic. So the production, the performance side, remember the competence versus performance, maybe the performance side is what's causing the non-target-like production. Okay, the next section we look into is various factors that affect the acquisition of a second language. And there's a whole bunch of different categories of factors, right? So affective factors, that is kind of emotional and motivational factors, include how are you motivated? Do I want to learn this language because I want to be able to communicate in this language, or will knowing this language get me to some other goal? Is it an instrument for me to achieve some other goal? Cognitive factors as well, as I mentioned, age. Some people start learning their second language quite early, so some of those cognitive development factors will still be operative. But there's also individual differences. We have different types of approaches to learning environments. Different communication strategies which will affect how we integrate our knowledge of a language. And we come back to the idea of a critical period. This was quite prominent at the end of our study of first language acquisition, but it's also important for second language acquisition. It does appear that the older you are, the harder it can be to actually learn in a fluent-like way a new language. Excuse me. Okay, so there's a lot of other details behind all this that you can review in the textbook and the learning outcomes document. The last section in the textbook, the last section that we go over, is the idea of the second language classroom. This is an environment, one of the more common environments where people do the work of learning a second language. And a lot of the research in this field is motivated by trying to improve that environment to optimize, to help people better learn this second language that they're trying to learn. So we see in this section a variety of things. One thing I do want to point out is that because as I record this video, we are kind of transitioning from the 8th edition of this textbook to the 9th edition. Some of the things that are in this chapter, the second language acquisition chapter in the 8th edition, have been reworked and moved into the new bilingualism chapter in the 9th edition. And because we're not covering bilingualism in this course, I have excised those bits from the curriculum entirely for this term, just to let us get through things as we're transitioning these editions. But what is left is some core ideas around the classroom. The idea that if you're learning a second language by living in a place where that second language is used, then you're going to acquire it differently than if you're learning in a classroom. In a classroom, there's more focus on form. You get consciously drilled with grammatical structures, particularly morphological and syntactic, but there is also some focus on pronunciation. So a lot of focus on form rather than just getting the communication happening in the more naturalistic scenarios. And the evidence we learn in this section, it does conflict on whether and how that focus on form affects the actual learning of the language, the actual acquisition of fluency in the language and competence. And we revisit this distinction between different types of corrections as well, reactive and preemptive corrections. Right? If you're in a classroom, there is always the option for the instructor to say, okay, you produce this form, but the more target-like form would look like this. So correcting, reactively correcting, reacting to what they produce. But as an instructor, we don't want to just catch the errors after they happen and try to redirect. It's often it can be helpful to anticipate, knowing how people progress, anticipate, okay, here's where you're at. Let's review this thing that without getting ahead of it, people tend to make this kind of error here. So let's focus on that, preemptively correct the thing that you might be about to do. So there's some discussion about that in the textbook. So that is a rather in-depth walk through the content of this chapter, the content that you'll be responsible for. So I hope that's helpful. Again, as always, you go through the textbook for more detail and specifics on these topics, and you can use the learning outcomes to help guide that. This video has been structured largely around the learning outcomes document, so that should help situate things. And yeah, that's all for now.